All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that's been making waves in the world of global finance, and that's the future of reserve currencies.
Yeah, it's a big one for sure.
It really is, and we've got a fascinating article here from the IMF's Finance and Development Journal.
Ah, good
It
source.
is, and it really lays out the arguments and different perspectives on this question of, what comes next for these big, powerful currencies
Right, because the US dollar has been king of the hill for a long time.
for
Yeah.
about a century.
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to imagine something else taking over.
It really is. But the article makes a pretty compelling case that things could be changing and maybe faster than we think.
Yeah, there are definitely some cracks starting to show.
Okay, so before we get into what the future might hold, let's do a quick recap. Remind me why the dollar got so powerful in the first place. What made it the top dog globally?
Well, I think a big part of it is the sheer size and accessibility of US financial markets.
Right, so lots of activity, lots of buyers and sellers. You can get in and out easily.
Exactly. It's what we call deep liquidity. And then on top of that, you've got the US government, which has historically been seen as pretty stable.
Well, it's stable compared to a lot of other places, at least.
Uh-huh, right. It's all relative.
Yeah.
But that stability makes people trust the dollar more, you know? It's like
Yeah.
if you're choosing a bank.
Yeah, you want one that's been around forever, has a good reputation.
Exactly. You don't want one that's going to disappear overnight with all your money.
Absolutely. But here's the thing that I found interesting in the article. Even the 2008 financial crisis, which you'd think would have hurt the dollar,
You would.
actually made it stronger in a way.
Yeah, that was a classic case of what we call flight to safety.
Break that down for me.
Sure. So basically, when things started to really go south in the global economy, investors kind of freaked out, right?
Understandably.
Oh, yeah. And they started pulling their money out of anything that seemed even remotely risky and piled it all into U.S. Treasury bonds.
So even though the crisis kind of started in the U.S.,
Even though it seems counterintuitive, but
they still saw the dollar as the safest bet.
yeah, like the least bad option, at least in their minds.
Wow. So even in a crisis, people doubled down on the dollar. But the article suggests that this might not be sustainable forever, right?
Right. And a lot of that has to do with some of the underlying economic trends we're seeing in the U.S.
Okay, like what?
Well, they highlight things like the persistent trade deficits, the U.S. buying way more from other countries than it sells.
Right.
And then you've got the massive and growing national debt.
Yeah, that's been in the news a lot lately.
For good reason. And both of these factors, they start to chip away at a currency's credibility.
How so? I mean, how do those things connect to a currency's power?
It comes down to trust, really.
Yeah.
Imagine if you're constantly borrowing money from your friends and never really paying them back. Eventually, they might start wondering if you're good for it.
Yeah, their trust would definitely erode.
Exactly. And it's kind of similar with countries.
So if the U.S. keeps racking up debt, it could make people less confident in the dollar.
Yeah. Less confident in its long-term value, and then they start looking for alternatives.
Okay, so it's like the dollar is having a bit of a popularity crisis. So if the dollar's on the decline, then who's going to take its place? The article seems to think the euro is the most likely candidate.
Yeah, it does have some things going for it.
Like what?
Well, for starters, it's got a huge economy backing it up. The combined economies of the Eurozone countries.
Right. That's a massive market.
Plus, it has a pretty stable political system, and the European Central Bank has a really good track record when it comes to keeping inflation under control.
Okay, those are some solid advantages. But then why hasn't the euro already surpassed the dollar? It seems like it's had plenty of time.
Well, there are a few things holding it back.
Okay, like what?
One thing the article mentions is this anti-growth bias in the Eurozone.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit technical. What does that actually mean in real-world terms?
It basically means that they prioritize stability, maybe even at the expense of faster economic growth.
Oh, I see. Like they're playing it safe.
Exactly. For example, Germany, which is a real powerhouse in the Eurozone,
Right.
they're very reluctant to spend money to stimulate their economy, even when things are slow.
Interesting. So it's like they're the super responsible friend who always balances their checkbook perfectly, but never wants to splurge on anything fun.
Ha ha. That's a great way to put it. And that can make investors hesitant, especially if they're looking for high returns.
Yeah, if you're looking for excitement, the Eurozone might not be the place to be.
Right. And then on top of that, you've got the whole issue of the Eurozone structure, managing a single currency across so many different countries.
Wasn't that a big problem during the Greek debt crisis?
Exactly. It really exposed some of the weaknesses in how the Eurozone is set up, and it made people question its long-term stability.
So maybe not as rock solid as it first appears. And then the article also points out that even though it's used within Europe, the euro hasn't really taken off globally the way some people predicted.
It hasn't, and there's a geopolitical angle to this, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about countries like Japan or the oil-rich Gulf states.
Okay.
They rely heavily on the U.S. for security.
Ah, so it's like a strategic alliance.
Exactly. So even if using the euro might make more economic sense in some cases, they stick with the dollar because of those geopolitical ties.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's about global power dynamics too. That's fascinating. All right, so the euro has its own hurdles to overcome, but what about some of the other potential contenders out there? The article mentions the Japanese yen, but it doesn't sound too optimistic.
Yeah, the yen is kind of a cautionary tale.
What happened there?
Well, back in the 80s, Japan's economy was booming. They had this massive bubble, but then it burst.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah, and it led to decades of economic stagnation, which really damaged the yen's reputation on the global stage.
So it's like a reminder that your own house needs to be in order before you can really play in the big leagues of global finance.
Precisely. You need a strong, stable domestic economy if you want your currency to be taken seriously internationally.
Okay, that makes sense. So now we have to talk about the elephant in the room, China. With its economy growing so rapidly, it seems like the yuan is destined to become a major player, right?
On paper, it definitely has the potential.
I mean, just look at the sheer size of China's economy.
Exactly, but there are some pretty big obstacles in its way.
Like what?
Well, China still has a lot of control over the flow of money in and out of the country.
What do you mean by that?
They have these things called capital controls that limit how much yuan can be exchanged for other currencies.
Oh, so even if you wanted to trade in yuan, it might not be that easy to get your hands on it.
Exactly. Plus, China's financial system, while it's growing fast, it's still pretty opaque compared to more established markets.
What do you mean by opaque?
Well, there are concerns about transparency and regulation. It's not always clear how things work, and that makes some investors nervous.
So there's a bit of a trust issue there, at least for now.
Yeah, and until those issues are addressed, it's going to be hard for the yuan to really challenge the dollar's dominance.
Okay, so we've got the dollar facing some serious headwinds, the euro with its own set of limitations, the yen fading into the background, and China's yuan still facing some major hurdles. So where does that leave us?
Well, the article suggests a pretty radical idea.
Oh, do tell.
What if we created a brand new global reserve currency?
Whoa, hold on, start from the beginning. A brand new currency for the whole world.
Yeah, that's the idea. Some economists like Joseph Stiglitz, they've argued for this kind of system. They say it would be much more stable.
More stable than relying on a single country's currency?
Exactly, because it wouldn't be tied to any one country's economic fortunes.
Okay, I can see the logic there, but how would that even work? Who would manage this new currency?
Well, one idea is to base it on the IMF's special drawing rights, or SDRs.
SDRs, remind me what those are again.
They're kind of like this international reserve asset that the IMF created. It's a basket of different currencies, so it's already a bit more diversified than any single currency.
Okay, that makes sense, but could that really become the world's new go-to currency?
It's a long shot for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine.
For starters, there just aren't enough SDRs in circulation to meet global demand.
Ah, so it's like trying to feed a whole city with just a few loaves of bread.
Exactly. Plus, there are a lot of tricky questions about how it would be managed and governed.
Right, who gets to call the shots?
Exactly. And then you've got countries like China and Russia who are pushing for a new reserve currency system, but it's not just about economics for them, is it?
No, it feels like there's a lot more going on there.
There is. It's about power dynamics, shifting global influence, challenging the established order.
So it's not just about money, it's about who gets to write the rules of the game.
Exactly. And that makes this whole discussion about reserve currencies even more interesting.
So it looks like we're in a bit of a transition phase then.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
The dollar's losing its grip, but there's no clear successor waiting in the wings.
And that creates a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, that's for sure. We'll have to keep exploring these possibilities and see how things unfold.
Definitely. This is a story that's just getting started.
Okay, so we just spent some time looking at the contenders who are kind of lining up to maybe take the dollar's crown, so to speak.
Yeah, a lot of potential successors, but each with their own question marks.
Definitely. And it seems like we're headed for a world where things are going to be a bit more fragmented when it comes to global currencies.
Yeah, a multipolar system, as some people call it.
And that raises some interesting questions about, what the consequences of that would be for the global economy.
For sure, it's uncharted territory in a lot of ways.
The article we're looking at, it hints at some potential benefits of a less dollar-centric world.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, one thing it mentions is that it could force the U.S. to finally address some of those deep-rooted economic imbalances.
Okay, you're talking about those big trade deficits and the national debt.
Exactly, those elephants in the room.
Uh-huh. Right. But how would a less powerful dollar actually force them to deal with those issues?
Well, the thinking is that right now, the U.S. kind of enjoys this exorbitant privilege because the dollar is the dominant reserve currency. Everyone needs dollars for trade, so they buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which is basically lending money to the U.S. government.
Right. Keeps those interest rates nice and low, makes it cheap to borrow.
Exactly. But if the dollar loses its top spot, that easy money could dry up pretty quickly.
Ah, so they'd have to face higher interest rates, making it more expensive to borrow, and suddenly those spending habits might need a reality check.
Yeah, like a first budget makeover.
Uh-huh, exactly. It might be painful in the short term, but it could actually lead to a healthier U.S. economy in the long run.
Potentially. But what about the rest of the world? I mean, what happens if the U.S. economy takes a hit because it can't borrow so easily anymore?
That's a legitimate concern. I mean, the U.S. is still a massive part of the global economy, so any slowdown there would have ripple effects.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, a less dominant dollar could force the U.S. to be more fiscally responsible, which could ultimately be good for everyone.
But it also creates more uncertainty and potential for volatility in the short term.
Exactly. There's no easy answer here. It's a balancing act.
Okay, so there's a potential upside, but definitely some risks involved. The article also talks about the risk of instability in a multipolar currency system.
Yeah, that's something that worries a lot of economists.
Can you unpack that for me? What kind of instability are we talking about?
Imagine a world where you've got several major currencies, all competing for dominance, but without any clear hierarchy.
So kind of like a free-for-all.
Exactly. And each country is pursuing its own economic policies, often with little regard for what other countries are doing.
So one country might be trying to lower its currency's value to boost exports, while another is raising interest rates to fight inflation.
Exactly. And those conflicting policies can create a lot of chaos in the global financial system.
Sounds like a recipe for some serious market swings and unpredictable exchange rates.
Right. And that makes it really hard for businesses to plan for the future, to invest, to trade.
It's like everyone's playing a different tune, and the music is just a jumbled mess.
Haha. Exactly. And that lack of coordination, it can be especially dangerous during times of crisis.
Okay, so if there's a global economic downturn, and every country is just looking out for itself, things could get pretty ugly.
Yeah, you could see a breakdown of cooperation, everyone trying to protect their own interests, and that could actually make the crisis even worse.
That reminds me of what happened during the interwar period.
You're right on the money. That's often cited as a cautionary tale.
Because back then you had the British pound losing its dominance.
Right, and the dollar was rising but not quite ready to take over.
So you had this power vacuum.
Exactly. And it led to a lot of bigger thy neighbor policies, protectionism, currency wars, everyone trying to devalue their way out of trouble.
And that all contributed to the Great Depression, right?
Sadly, yes. It's a stark reminder of what can happen when global cooperation breaks down.
So are we doomed to repeat history?
Hmm.
Are we heading for another Great Depression?
I wouldn't say doomed, but it's definitely a risk we need to be aware of.
Well, at least we have more tools and mechanisms for international cooperation today than they did back then, right?
We do. Institutions like the IMF and the G20, they're designed to foster dialogue and prevent those kinds of destructive policies.
So there's hope for a more coordinated response.
There is, but those institutions can only do so much.
Right. It ultimately comes down to the willingness of individual countries to cooperate, especially when things get tough.
Absolutely. And that's where things get a bit more complicated.
Because right now, it feels like the geopolitical climate is pretty tense.
Yeah, you've got the rise of China, a more assertive Russia, shifting alliances in the Middle East. It's a multipolar world, not just in terms of currencies, but in terms of power dynamics, too.
And all of that feeds back into the global financial system.
It's all interconnected. Geopolitical tensions can rattle investor confidence, leading to capital flight and currency volatility.
And that economic instability can then fuel those political divisions even further.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
So it feels like we're at a crossroads. On the one hand, we could be moving towards a more balanced, more equitable global financial system where no single country has too much power,
But on the other hand, there's this very real risk of fragmentation and conflict.
which could lead to more instability, more uncertainty, maybe even another major economic crisis.
It's a high-stakes game, that's for sure.
So what can our listeners do to navigate this complex and uncertain world?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed, pay attention to what's happening in the global economy, keep track of the major currencies.
Do your homework, basically,
Exactly. Understand the political dynamics at play because they are just as important as the economic ones these days.
and be prepared for more volatility.
Oh, yeah. A fragmented system is almost guaranteed to be more unpredictable than what we've been used to.
So diversify those investments, have a long-term perspective.
Exactly. Don't panic over every little bump in the road.
Okay, solid advice. And it's a good reminder that we're all in this together. The more we understand what's going on, the better equipped we'll be to make smart decisions and whether whatever storms might be coming our way.
Couldn't agree more. It's about collective awareness, informed decision-making, and hopefully a little bit of collective wisdom to guide us through these choppy waters.
All right, on that note, it sounds like we've got even more to unpack when it comes to this whole idea of a multipolar world and what it means, not just for currencies, but for the global order as a whole.
Yeah, we've only just scratched the surface here.
Okay, so we've talked about the dollar potentially losing its grip as the top global currency and all the other currencies that are waiting in the wings.
Yeah, we've got quite a lineup of contenders hoping to step into the spotlight.
We do, but what does that actually look like? I mean, what might this future actually look like in practice?
It's hard to say for sure, but, we can make some educated guesses based on historical patterns and what we're seeing happening right now.
So let's put on our futurist hats
Oh.
and try to imagine some possibilities here.
All right, let's do it.
So what's one scenario that you could see playing out?
Well, one possibility is that we move towards a more regionalized system.
Okay, so instead of one globally dominant currency, we might have several big currencies, each kind of ruling their own region.
Yeah, exactly. Like imagine a euro-dominated bloc in Europe, a yuan-centric zone in Asia, maybe even a bloc centered around the Indian rupee.
Interesting. So it's like the world dividing into different currency zones, each with its own powerhouse currency.
Yeah, and those zones might form based on things like existing trade relationships, shared economic interests, or, even geopolitical alliances.
So it's not just about economic, it's about politics and global power dynamics too.
Always. But what about the dollar in this scenario? Do you think it would just disappear?
Yeah, what happens to the old king?
I don't think it would vanish overnight, at least not in the early stages. It still has the advantage of being the incumbent. It has that deep liquidity we talked about. And the U.S. financial system is still pretty well established.
Right, it's got that history, that reputation.
Exactly. So I think it would probably stick around for a while, but its role would gradually diminish as those regional blocs gain strength.
So it's like a slow fade out rather than a sudden crash.
Yeah, more of a gradual transition.
Okay, that's one possibility. What other scenarios can you imagine?
Well, another possibility, and this one might be a bit more, let's say, exciting, is a system where you have multiple currencies all competing for global dominance.
So no clear winner, just constant competition.
Exactly. Think of it like a financial free-for-all.
Now that sounds a little bit chaotic.
It could be, but it could also be incredibly dynamic and innovative.
Okay, so how would that work?
Well, you could have countries constantly trying to make their currencies more attractive, by offering lower transaction costs, better stability, things like that.
So it's like a race to the top, but also maybe a risk of a race to the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. Some countries might resort to manipulating their currencies, trying to gain a short-term advantage.
Which could lead to currency wars and even more instability.
Exactly. So this scenario would definitely require a lot of international cooperation and coordination.
Otherwise, it's just going to be a recipe for chaos.
Pretty much. It's a high-stakes game with no guaranteed winners.
Okay, so we've got regional order versus global competition. Two very different paths. But it seems like the outcome really hinges on what governments and policymakers decide to do.
Absolutely. They're the ones who set the rules of the game, through trade agreements, financial regulations, and, of course, their geopolitical strategies.
So it's not just about watching the currency markets, it's about understanding the bigger picture.
The political landscape, the economic forces at play, it's all connected.
It's complex stuff. So if there's one key takeaway from all of this for our listeners, what would it be?
I think the biggest takeaway is that change is coming, like it or not. The era of the dollar's unchallenged reign, it's coming to an end.
We're moving into uncharted territory.
We are. And that can be scary, but it can also be exciting. It could be an opportunity to build a more balanced, more equitable global financial system.
But it's going to require us to adapt, to be flexible, to think differently.
Exactly. We need to stay informed, engage in these discussions, and be willing to embrace new ideas and new solutions.
It's like realizing your favorite band isn't going to be around forever.
Oh, how so?
Well, it's a little sad, but it also opens up the possibility of discovering new music, new sounds, new experiences.
I love that analogy. It's about being open to the possibilities, to the evolution of things.
Exactly. So, to wrap things up, let's remind our listeners what we've explored in this deep dive.
Sure. We started by looking at why the dollar became so powerful in the first place. Then we examined the challenges it's facing now, and we explored the potential contenders that might take its place.
We talked about the potential benefits and risks of a more fragmented system, and we even imagined some possible scenarios for what the future might hold.
Yeah, from regional currency blocks to a global financial free-for-all.
It's a lot to take in, but it's crucial information for anyone who wants to understand where the world is headed.
Absolutely. Because the future of money is the future of everything, really.
It impacts all of our lives, so it's something we should all be paying attention to.
Couldn't agree more. And that's why we do these deep dives to help people understand these complex issues and make sense of the changing world around us.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the topics that matter.
See you then.